My boyfriend wouldn't stop pinching me hard enough to leave bruises and called it his love language. When Ryan and I started dating, he'd give these little affectionate touches, holding my hand, playing with my hair, normal couple stuff. Then, about 3 months in, he started pinching me. Not hard at first, just little pinches on my arm when we were watching TV. He said it was his way of saying he loved me without words. I thought it was weird but harmless, like when some people tap 3 times to mean I love you. But the pinches got harder and more frequent. He'd pinch my thigh under the table at restaurants, my side when we were in line at stores, my upper arm when we walked together. When I asked him to stop, he said I was rejecting his love language, and that hurt him deeply. He actually teared up saying touch was how he expressed affection, and I was making him feel bad for loving me. So I let it continue even though I was getting bruises. Ryan would see the marks and say they were love marks, proof of how much he cared. He'd pinch the bruised spots again, saying he was adding more love. When I wore long sleeves to cover them, he said I was ashamed of his affection. He'd pull up my sleeves in public and pinch my arms where everyone could see, saying I should be proud of being loved. My friends started noticing and asking if I was okay. When my friend Janet saw him pinch my neck at her birthday party, she pulled me aside. I explained it was his love language, and she said that wasn't a thing, that he was hurting me and calling it affection. Ryan overheard and told Janet she didn't understand our connection. He said some people loved through words, some through gifts, and he loved through physical expression. Janet said physical expression shouldn't leave bruises, but Ryan accused her of being jealous and single. At my cousin's wedding, Ryan pinched me throughout the ceremony. Every time the couple said something sweet, pinch. During the vows, pinch. When they kissed, he pinched my thigh so hard I gasped out loud. People turned to look, and Ryan whispered that I was just emotional about love. During the reception, he pinched me every time we were in photos, saying it would capture our real dynamic. My aunt asked why I kept flinching in the pictures. The breaking point was at my job. I worked at a bank and had to wear short sleeves as part of the dress code. The bruises were visible and customers started asking if I needed help. My manager, Kevin, pulled me into his office saying they had resources for domestic violence. I tried explaining about love languages, but Kevin said he didn't care what Ryan called it. Abuse was abuse. He gave me pamphlets and said the bank would support whatever I decided to do. That night, I told Ryan the bruises were affecting my job, and he said I should quit if they couldn't understand our love. He said minimum wage jobs were everywhere, but our connection was special. He pinched my shoulder while saying it, twisting the skin until I pulled away. He said pulling away was rejecting his love, and started pinching my other shoulder harder. I had had enough. I told him I needed space to think, and he spent an hour pinching me repeatedly, saying each one was a reminder of his love that I'd miss when I was alone. The pinches were so aggressive that night I had to call in sick the next day because the bruises were too dark to cover with makeup. While Ryan was at work, I went to his gym where he'd been bragging about his new personal trainer Mike, who was transforming his body. I asked to speak with Mike privately, saying I was Ryan's girlfriend and worried about some things I'd noticed. Mike was immediately concerned, thinking Ryan had an injury he was hiding. I showed Mike my arms, covered in fingerprint bruises. Mike asked who did this, and I said Ryan called it his love language. Mike's face changed completely. He asked how long this had been happening, and I showed him my legs, my shoulders, my neck, all covered in various stages of bruising. Mike took photos with my permission and said this wasn't love, it was assault. Turns out Mike wasn't just a personal trainer. He was working on his doctorate in physical therapy and had training in recognizing abuse patterns. He said the bruising pattern was consistent with systematic physical abuse, not affection. He asked if I wanted to press charges, and I said I just wanted Ryan to stop. Mike said he'd handle it. The next day, Ryan came home pale and shaking. He stood in the doorway with his face drained of color and his whole body shaking. His hands were trembling, so hard he had to hold onto the doorframe to steady himself. I was sitting on the couch where I'd been since getting home from work, and I just watched him stand there looking like someone had punched him in the stomach. He opened his mouth to say something, but nothing came out at first. Then he said Mike confronted him at the gym in front of everyone. He said Mike pulled him into the main workout area where all the trainers and members were doing their sessions and showed everyone the photos of my bruises. Ryan kept saying the word photos over and over like he couldn't believe they existed. He said Mike called him an abuser right there in front of the whole gym. He said people stopped their workouts to stare at him. He said Mike told the other trainers that Ryan was systematically hurting his girlfriend and calling it affection. Ryan's voice cracked when he said the gym manager pulled him aside afterward and said they were reviewing his membership. He looked at me like I was supposed to comfort him, like I was supposed to tell him it would be okay. But I just sat there feeling strangely calm. For the first time since we started dating, I was watching him panic about consequences. He was the one who looked scared. He was the one who needed reassurance. And I had absolutely nothing to give him. I asked him what exactly Mike said. Ryan stumbled over his words trying to explain. He said Mike threatened to go to the police if Ryan didn't leave me alone. He kept saying it was all a misunderstanding. He said Mike didn't understand our relationship. He said the bruises looked worse than they actually were, like photos somehow exaggerated reality instead of just showing what was really there. He started pacing back and forth in the doorway, not quite coming into the apartment but not leaving either. He kept running his hands through his hair and his breathing was getting faster. He said Mike showed the photos to at least 6 other trainers. He said they all looked at him like he was some kind of monster. He said one of the trainers, some guy named Keith, told him he made them all uncomfortable, and maybe he should find a different gym. Ryan's voice got higher and more desperate as he talked. But the whole time he was talking, I noticed something. He wasn't pinching me. His hands stayed in his own space. He kept reaching toward me and then pulling back like he suddenly remembered something. It hit me that he was finally aware his love language might actually be evidence of a crime. Ryan started begging me to call Mike. He said I needed to explain that everything was fine between us. He said I needed to tell Mike we were happy together. He said I needed to make Mike understand that the pinching was just how we showed affection. His voice got louder and more frantic. He said if I just called Mike right now and cleared everything up, the gym would probably let him keep his membership. He said we could fix this if I just made one phone call. He moved closer to me on the couch, and I could see tears starting in his eyes. He said we were happy, weren't we? He said Mike had ruined everything by sticking his nose where it didn't belong. He said this was between us, and nobody else had any right to judge our relationship. I looked at him and said I wasn't calling anyone. I said I needed time to think about things. His face changed completely. He started crying for real now, big tears running down his face. He reached for my arms like he always did, but stopped himself halfway through the motion. I had flinched. I hadn't even meant to. It was just automatic. My body pulled away from his hands before my brain could tell it to stay still. And I saw the exact moment when he realized I was afraid of him. Something in his expression shifted from desperate to shocked. He stared at his own hands like they belonged to someone else. I told him he needed to stay somewhere else tonight. I said I needed space to figure out what I wanted. He immediately argued that this was his apartment too. He said he paid rent here. He said I couldn't just kick him out. But then I reminded him the lease was only in my name. I said his credit was too bad when we moved in together, so we put everything in my name. I watched his face as he realized I was right. For the first time in our entire relationship, I was using information as power. I was the one controlling the narrative. He always made every decision about where we went and what we did and how we spent our time. He always framed every conversation so he was the victim and I was being unreasonable. But right now, in this moment, I had the power, and we both knew it. The lease was mine. The apartment was mine. And I was telling him to leave. Ryan went into the bedroom and started throwing clothes into a duffel bag. He was still crying. He kept coming back out to the living room to say something, and then going back to pack more stuff. He said he loved me. He said Mike had ruined everything. He said we could fix this if I just gave him another chance. He said he would stop pinching me if that's what I really wanted. He said he didn't understand why everyone was making such a big deal out of something so small. He zipped up his bag and stood by the door again. He said he would stay at Keith's place. He said I should call him when I was ready to talk. He said we were supposed to be together forever. He reached for me one more time, but I stepped back. He left and I locked the door behind him. I stood there for a minute just listening to make sure he was really gone. Then I went back to the couch and sat down. I looked at my arms covered in bruises in all different colors. Purple and blue and yellow and green. Some were fresh from yesterday. Some were a week old. Some were fading to nothing. I realized I couldn't remember the last time I sat in my own apartment without being afraid of when he would pinch me next. I couldn't remember the last time I relaxed on this couch without tensing up every time he moved. The fear had become so normal I stopped noticing it was there. But now he was gone and the apartment was quiet and I was alone. And I wasn't afraid. I called Mike the next morning. I thanked him for what he did at the gym. I asked him what exactly happened because Ryan's version of events was probably not accurate. Mike's voice on the phone was calm and professional. He said he pulled Ryan aside privately first. He said he showed Ryan the photos and told him the bruising pattern indicated systematic abuse that would only get worse over time. He said he explained to Ryan that what he was doing wasn't affection, it was assault. He said Ryan laughed it off. Mike said Ryan actually smiled and said I liked it, that I understood it was his way of showing love. That's when Mike decided to make the conversation public. He said he walked Ryan out into the main gym area and told the other trainers what was happening. He said he did it to create accountability and social consequences. He said abusers operate in private and thrive on secrecy, so exposing them publicly was often the only way to make them stop. Mike said he might have overstepped by threatening to go to the police. He said his training taught him that abusers respond to power and public exposure more than they respond to private conversations or reasoning. He said he knew threatening Ryan would scare him more than asking him nicely to change his behavior. Then Mike asked if I was safe. He asked if Ryan was still in the apartment. I told him Ryan left last night and was staying with a friend. Mike said that was good, but I needed to be careful. He said the most dangerous time in an abusive relationship is right after the abuser loses control. He said Ryan would probably try to get back in by apologizing and making promises. He said I should expect Ryan to alternate between being sorry and being angry. He said whatever happened, I shouldn't let Ryan back in the apartment. Mike said he knew someone who could help me. He said there was a counselor named Vivian Torres who ran groups at the community center for people dealing with domestic violence. I felt my stomach drop when he said domestic violence. That phrase made everything feel too real and too serious. I said I wasn't sure about going to a domestic violence counselor because that felt like admitting Ryan had been abusing me. I said maybe it was just a weird relationship dynamic that got out of hand. Mike was quiet for a second. Then he said, I already admitted it was abuse when I came to him for help. He said I showed him my bruises and asked him to make Ryan stop. He said that was me recognizing I was being hurt and asking for intervention. He said going to see Vivian was just the next step in getting safe. I said I would think about it. Mike gave me Vivian's phone number and told me to call whenever I was ready. I called the bank after I hung up with Mike. I told Kevin I needed a few personal days to deal with the situation. He asked immediately if I was safe. He asked if this was related to the bruises he saw last week. I said yes. He didn't ask for details. He just said take the whole week off with pay. He said the bank had an employee assistance program that included counseling and legal consultation if I needed it. He said I could access those resources confidentially, and it wouldn't affect my job. He said HR had protocols for situations like this, and they would support whatever I decided to do. I thanked him and said I would let him know when I was ready to come back. He said take as much time as I needed and to please stay safe. My phone started buzzing with texts from Ryan around noon. The first few messages were apologies. He said he was sorry for scaring me. He said he never meant to hurt me. He said he loved me so much and he just wanted to show me that love. He said he would never pinch me again if I didn't want him to. Then the messages changed. He said I betrayed him by talking to Mike. He said I made him look like a monster when he was just showing affection. He said I ruined his reputation at the gym where he'd been working out for 3 years. He said everyone there thought he was an abuser now because I couldn't handle his love language. He said I was too sensitive. He said most girlfriends would be grateful to have someone who loved them as much as he loved me. The messages kept coming all day. Some were sorry, some were angry, some blamed me, some blamed Mike. I didn't respond to any of them, but I saved every single one. Something inside me knew I might need evidence later. 2 days later, I walked into the community center and found Vivian Torres waiting in a small office with comfortable chairs and soft lighting. She stood up when I came in and shook my hand with a warm grip that somehow made me feel less scared. She gestured to a chair and asked me to start from the beginning, to tell her about the whole relationship. I started talking, and once I got going, I couldn't stop. I told her about the first pinch on the couch, how it seemed cute at first. I told her about the bruises and how Ryan called them love marks. I told her about the wedding and the bank and how customers asked if I needed help. Hearing myself say it all out loud to someone who worked with abuse survivors made something click in my brain. I realized I'd ignored so many signs, so many moments where I should have left. Vivian didn't interrupt or look at me like I was stupid for staying. She just listened and sometimes asked questions about specific incidents or how I felt during them. She asked if Ryan ever apologized after pinching me hard, and I said no. He just told me it was love. She asked if he ever respected when I said stop, and I realized he never did. Not once. When I finished talking, Vivian leaned forward and started explaining the cycle of abuse. She said Ryan's behavior fit patterns she'd seen hundreds of times before. She said the pinching itself wasn't the real problem. It was what the pinching represented. She said it showed his need to hurt me, to mark my body so everyone could see I belonged to him, to make me accept pain while telling me it was affection. She said when I tried to set boundaries, he reframed my no as rejection of his love, which made me the bad person for having normal human limits. She said that was textbook manipulation and control. I started crying while she talked because I'd spent months thinking something was wrong with me for not liking his love language. Vivian handed me a box of tissues and said grief was normal. She said I was mourning the relationship I thought I had, the version where Ryan actually loved me instead of controlled me. She said that loss was real and valid even though the relationship was harmful. 3 days after Ryan moved out, I was working my shift at the bank when I saw him walk through the front door. My whole body went cold and I froze at my counter. He walked straight toward me with this desperate look on his face. Before he could reach me, Miriam stepped out from behind her counter and positioned herself between us. She told him he needed to leave. Ryan tried to go around her, but she moved with him, keeping herself as a barrier. He said he just wanted to talk to his girlfriend for a minute. Miriam raised her voice loud enough that customers in line turned to look. She said I was working and he was disrupting business operations. Kevin's office door opened and he came out fast when he heard the commotion. He walked right up to Ryan and told him to leave the premises immediately, or security would be called. Ryan tried to appeal to Kevin like they were both reasonable men dealing with a dramatic woman. He said this was all a misunderstanding and he just needed 5 minutes to talk to me. Kevin cut him off and said he saw the bruises on my arms last week. He said he knew exactly what kind of misunderstanding this was. Ryan's face changed when he realized Kevin wasn't going to help him. He looked at me and his eyes had this mix of anger and hurt that made my stomach drop. Then he turned and walked out without another word. I stood there shaking while customers pretended not to stare. Miriam came over and touched my shoulder gently, asking if I was okay. She admitted she'd noticed I was jumpy lately and wearing long sleeves even when it was hot outside. She said she didn't want to pry into my personal life, but she was glad I was getting help. She said if I ever needed someone to walk me to my car after work, or just sit with me during breaks, she was available. Her offer was so simple and practical, not dramatic or pitying. That quiet support meant more to me than I could express, because she wasn't making a big deal about rescuing me, just offering to be there. I met with Vivian again the next day and told her about Ryan showing up at work. She asked if I'd thought about getting a protective order. I admitted the idea felt too serious, like something that happened to other people in worse situations. Vivian explained that protective orders existed exactly for situations like mine. She said Ryan had a history of physical abuse and he wasn't respecting boundaries. She said showing up at my workplace after I told him to stay away was escalation. She said abusers often got more dangerous when they lost control. Vivian connected me with a legal advocate who worked through the community center helping people file protective orders for free. The advocate explained the whole process and what evidence I would need. I showed her the photos Mike took of my bruises and the texts Ryan sent alternating between apologizing and blaming me. She looked through everything carefully and said I had a strong case. She said I could file as soon as tomorrow if I wanted to. That night, I stood in my bathroom looking at my arms in the mirror. The bruises were finally fading to yellow and green instead of purple and black. I touched one of the marks and realized Ryan would have added fresh bruises by now if he were still here. I counted back and realized I hadn't been pinched in almost a week. The absence of pain felt strange in my body, like I'd gotten so used to bracing for it that not being hurt felt wrong somehow. I kept waiting for fingers to dig into my skin, but it never happened. I decided to file for the protective order. The next morning, I met the legal advocate at the courthouse and we spent hours filling out forms. The paperwork asked me to describe the abuse in clinical detail with dates and locations. I wrote down pinched my arms, legs, neck, and torso, repeatedly causing bruising. The words looked so simple on paper, but they didn't capture the fear or the gaslighting. They didn't explain how Ryan made me doubt my own right to say no to being hurt. They didn't show how he cried and said I was rejecting his love every time I asked him to stop. The advocate helped me attach the photos and print out the text messages. We submitted everything to the clerk's office and then waited in a hallway for our turn with the judge. The judge called us into chambers that same afternoon. She reviewed the photos and read my statement while I sat there trying not to shake. She asked me a few questions about whether Ryan had access to weapons and whether he knew where I lived. Then she signed the temporary protective order right there. The order said Ryan had to stay at least 500 feet away from me, my workplace, and my apartment. It said he couldn't contact me by phone, text, email, or through other people. A hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks from now where Ryan could contest the order if he wanted to. The judge said for now I had legal protection, and if Ryan violated the order, I should call the police immediately. I walked out of the courthouse holding the paperwork and feeling like I could breathe fully for the first time in months. The police served Ryan with the protective order later that day. I knew because Keith called me around 6 in the evening. His voice sounded strained and uncomfortable when he said my name. He apologized right away, saying he had no idea what Ryan was doing to me. He said Ryan always seemed controlling, but he thought that was just his personality, not that he was actually hurting me. Keith told me about the officer showing up at his apartment and handing Ryan the papers. He said Ryan's face went white when he read through the order. Keith sounded genuinely upset when he said he told Ryan he needs to find somewhere else to stay. He said he couldn't have someone in his place who was hurting women, that it made him sick to think about. I thanked Keith for calling and for doing the right thing. After we hung up, I felt this weird mix of relief and fear. Ryan knew now that I'd taken legal action. He knew there were consequences. 2 days passed without any contact from Ryan. I started to relax a little, thinking maybe he'd actually respect the order. Then Coral called me at work. Her voice was tight with anger when she told me Ryan had been waiting outside my apartment building. She said she saw him standing near the entrance, looking up at my windows. Coral walked right up to him and told him he needed to leave or she was calling the police. Ryan tried to argue with her, saying he just wanted to talk, that the protective order was ridiculous. Coral didn't back down. She pulled out her phone and held it up so he could see. Ryan left before she could dial, but Coral said she watched him walk all the way down the street to make sure he was gone. She called me right away to tell me what happened. I could hear the protective anger in her voice, like she wanted to do more than just chase him off. I hung up with Coral and immediately called the police non-emergency line. My hands shook while I waited on hold. A dispatcher took my information and said an officer would come to the bank to take my statement. Officer Raymond Torres showed up about 30 minutes later. He was maybe 40, with a calm manner that made me feel like he took this seriously. He sat across from me in Kevin's office while I explained what Coral had told me. Raymond wrote everything down in a small notebook. He explained that violating a protective order is a criminal offense, and they take it seriously. He said he'd file a report, and that Ryan would be contacted about the violation. Raymond looked me in the eye when he said if Ryan shows up again, I should call 911 immediately, not wait or try to handle it myself. He said my safety was the priority, and I shouldn't worry about bothering the police. After he left, I sat in Kevin's office for a few more minutes, trying to calm down. The fact that Ryan showed up so quickly after getting served scared me more than I wanted to admit. I had a session with Vivian scheduled for that afternoon. When I told her about Ryan violating the order, she didn't look surprised. She said abusers often escalate when they lose control, and Ryan had already shown he won't respect legal boundaries. Vivian helped me develop a safety plan. We went through everything in detail. She told me to change my routine, park in different spots, vary my schedule. She said I should always have my phone charged and keep emergency numbers saved. It felt paranoid writing all this down, but Vivian explained it was necessary. She also suggested I tell trusted neighbors and coworkers what Ryan looks like so they can help watch out for him. She showed me photos on her phone of other women's safety plans, thick binders full of information and contact numbers. I realized this was serious in a way I hadn't fully accepted yet. This wasn't just about a bad breakup. This was about staying safe from someone who might hurt me worse. I printed out a photo of Ryan from my phone the next day. Looking at his face on the paper felt strange. He looked normal in the picture, smiling at the camera. Nothing about the photo showed what he'd done to me. I showed the picture to Coral first. She studied it carefully and said she'd make sure all the building maintenance staff knew to watch for him. Then I went to several of my neighbors' apartments. Most of them were supportive and said they'd keep an eye out. Mrs. Chen from 2 doors down took the photo and held it up to the light like she was memorizing every detail. She said she always thought Ryan seemed too possessive, the way he'd grab my arm when we walked together. She said she noticed how he'd steer me around like I couldn't walk on my own. I felt this rush of embarrassment and validation at the same time. Other people saw warning signs I couldn't see because I was too close to the situation. Mrs. Chen patted my hand and told me I was brave for getting away from him. At the bank the next morning, Kevin called me into his office. He'd already heard about the violation from me the day before. He said he'd updated security with Ryan's photo and information about the protective order. The security guard, Noah, nodded at me when I walked past his desk. Kevin also told me he was moving my workstation. He walked me over to a new desk that wasn't visible from the front windows. It was tucked back near the offices, away from public view. Kevin also said I could park in his reserved spot, which was closer to the building entrance. He said these were small things, but he wanted me to feel protected. I almost cried right there in the middle of the bank. These small accommodations made me feel protected in a way I haven't felt in months. Kevin squeezed my shoulder and said the whole staff was looking out for me. Miriam brought me coffee at my new desk and didn't say anything, just smiled. Janet called me that evening. I'd finally told her everything that happened since her birthday party. I sent her a long text earlier that day with all the details about the protective order and Ryan showing up at my building. Janet's voice was tight with anger when she answered. She said she was angry at herself for not pushing harder when she first saw the bruising. I reminded her that she did speak up, and Ryan shut her down. I told her she planted the seed that eventually grew into me getting help. Janet said she was proud of me for getting out. She offered to come stay with me if I was scared to be alone. I told her I was okay for now, but I might take her up on that later. We talked for over an hour about everything. She made me laugh, telling stories about terrible dates she'd been on. It felt good to talk about normal things, to remember I had a life outside of dealing with Ryan. 2 weeks later, the protective order hearing happened. I dressed carefully that morning, wearing long sleeves even though it was warm. I wanted to look put together and credible. The courthouse was busy with people moving through hallways and waiting in rooms. My legal advocate met me outside the courtroom. She went over what to expect one more time. Then we went inside. Ryan was already there with a lawyer. My stomach dropped when I saw him. He looked thinner, tired. His lawyer was a middle-aged woman in a gray suit. She tried to argue the order was unnecessary when the judge called the case. The lawyer claimed Ryan was just affectionate and I was overreacting. She made it sound like I was being dramatic about normal couple behavior. But the judge reviewed the photos, the texts, and the violation report. She looked at the pictures of my bruises for a long time. Then she looked at Ryan. The judge made the protective order permanent for 1 year and warned Ryan that any further violations will result in arrest. She said it clearly and firmly. Ryan's lawyer tried to argue, but the judge cut her off. It was over in less than 20 minutes. After the hearing, I walked out into the courthouse hallway. Ryan was standing near the elevators with his lawyer. Our eyes met across the room. He mouthed, "I'm sorry," at me. His lawyer pulled him away quickly, steering him toward the exit. But I saw genuine remorse in his face mixed with confusion. He looked like he still didn't fully understand why pinching me was wrong, like he thought this was all some big misunderstanding that got out of control. I felt a complicated mix of relief that he's legally required to stay away, and sadness that he may never actually comprehend what he did. My advocate touched my arm and asked if I was okay. I nodded and we walked toward the opposite exit. My hands were shaking, but I felt lighter somehow. I met with Vivian 2 days after the hearing. I told her about seeing Ryan in the hallway, and how I felt conflicted about his apology. Vivian leaned forward in her chair and explained that it's normal to grieve the relationship, and even miss the person who hurt you. She said this was especially true when the abuse was mixed with genuine affection at the beginning. She reminded me that Ryan was nice at first, that the pinching started small. She said healing isn't linear, and I'll have good days and bad days, moments of certainty and moments of doubt. Vivian told me some days I might feel strong and sure I made the right choice. Other days I might feel sad or guilty or confused. She said all of those feelings were valid and normal. What mattered was that I was safe now and learning to trust my own judgment again. I showed up at the community center on Thursday evening for my first support group meeting. Vivian had given me the address and told me to come whenever I felt ready. The room was small with folding chairs arranged in a circle and a box of tissues on a side table. 7 women were already sitting down when I walked in. Vivian smiled and gestured to an empty chair. She introduced me to the group using just my first name and explained I was new. The other women nodded and a few smiled in that sad, knowing way that made my chest tight. Vivian started the meeting by asking if anyone wanted to share what happened during their week. A woman named Kendall talked about running into her ex at the grocery store and how she froze in the cereal aisle until he left. Another woman described finally changing the locks on her apartment after 3 months of being too scared her boyfriend would show up angry. Then a woman with gray streaks in her hair spoke up. She said her ex-husband used to give her what he called love taps on her arms and shoulders. She demonstrated the motion, a quick, hard slap that she described as playful at first. She said it escalated over 5 years until one night he punched her in the face and broke her nose. She looked directly at me when she said abusers always start small and test boundaries. I felt sick hearing her story because I could see Ryan's pinching turning into slapping, then hitting, then worse. After the meeting ended, I thanked Vivian for inviting me. She asked how I felt, and I told her less alone, but also more scared, realizing how bad things could have gotten. She squeezed my shoulder gently and reminded me I got out before it reached that point. Mike texted me a few days later asking if I wanted to grab coffee. I met him at a cafe near the gym, sitting at an outdoor table where I could see people walking by. He looked tired and kept fidgeting with his coffee cup. He asked how I was doing with the protective order and everything. I told him about the support group and how it helped to hear other stories. Mike nodded and then admitted he'd been thinking a lot about how he handled things with Ryan. He said Ryan's gym membership got terminated after 2 other members complained they felt uncomfortable around him. Apparently, Ryan had been telling people at the gym that his girlfriend left him over nothing, that everyone was overreacting, that Mike ruined his life. The gym manager reviewed everything and decided Ryan created an unsafe environment. Mike looked relieved when he told me this, but also guilty. He said he kept wondering if he should have just encouraged me to go to the police instead of confronting Ryan himself. He worried that threatening Ryan was too aggressive, that maybe there was a better way to handle it. I watched him struggle with this and realized he genuinely cared about doing the right thing even when the situation was complicated. I told Mike he probably saved my life, or at least saved me from worse injuries than I already had. I explained that nothing else had worked. Not my friends speaking up, not my manager offering resources, not my own attempts to set boundaries. Ryan only stopped when another man made him stop, when Mike used his physical presence and authority to create consequences. Mike listened and said that's exactly what bothered him. He pointed out how messed up it was that another man had to use dominance to stop a man who was dominating me. I hadn't thought about it that way, but he was right. Mike admitted he'd been thinking about that contradiction a lot. He said it made him more aware of how he uses his physical size and authority, even when he's trying to help people. He told me about being more careful at the gym now, asking clients permission before adjusting their form, being conscious of his tone when giving instructions. I appreciated that he was actually learning something from this instead of just feeling proud of himself for being a hero. We talked for over an hour about power and control and how complicated it all was. When we left, Mike hugged me carefully and told me to call him if I ever needed anything. 3 months passed since the protective order became permanent. I started sleeping through most nights without waking up in a panic. The constant checking over my shoulder in parking lots happened less often, though I still did it sometimes. I went on a few casual dates, nothing serious, just testing the waters of being around men again. The bruises disappeared completely, fading from purple to green to yellow to nothing. But sometimes I still felt phantom sensations of being pinched, like my body remembered the pain even when there was no actual threat. I'd be sitting at work or watching TV and suddenly feel that sharp twist on my arm that made me flinch. It happened less and less, but it reminded me that healing wasn't just physical. My apartment felt safe now instead of like a place where I had to brace myself constantly. I could wear short sleeves without thinking about it. I could sit on my couch without remembering all the times Ryan pinched me there. Small, normal things felt like victories. Janet called and asked if I wanted to go out for dinner at this Italian place we both liked. We sat at a corner table and ordered wine and pasta. After we got our food, Janet asked how I was really doing. Not the polite surface answer I gave most people. I put down my fork and told her honestly. I said I was better but not fixed. That some days I felt strong and other days I felt broken. I told her I was angry at Ryan for hurting me and angry at myself for staying so long. I explained that I was grateful for everyone who helped me, but also frustrated that it took so many people intervening before I could leave on my own. Janet listened without interrupting or trying to fix anything. She didn't tell me I shouldn't blame myself or that I did the best I could. She just listened, and when I finished talking, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. She said she was glad I was safe now. That was it. No big speech or advice, just that simple statement. We finished dinner and talked about normal things like her job and a movie she wanted to see. It felt good to have a conversation that wasn't entirely about Ryan and the abuse and my recovery. A letter arrived at my apartment 2 weeks later, forwarded through the court system. The return address was Ryan's, but it came through official channels so it didn't violate the protective order. I stared at the envelope for a full minute before opening it. The letter was 3 pages long, handwritten in Ryan's neat printing. He apologized repeatedly and said he'd been going to therapy twice a week. He wrote that he finally understood what he did was wrong, that calling it a love language was manipulation, that he hurt me and there was no excuse. He said his therapist helped him see patterns of control and abuse in his behavior. He asked if we could talk, maybe meet for coffee in a public place, so he could apologize in person. He promised he wasn't trying to get back together, he just wanted closure, and to show me he'd changed. Part of me wanted to believe him. Part of me wanted to see genuine remorse and growth instead of the confused look he had at the courthouse. I brought the letter to my next session with Vivian. She read it carefully and then explained that abusers often learn therapy language to manipulate their way back into victims' lives. She said the letter hit all the right notes, the apologies and self-awareness and promises of change, but that didn't mean it was genuine. She asked what I wanted to do. I thought about it for a long time and decided not to respond. I didn't owe Ryan closure or forgiveness or a chance to prove himself. I folded the letter back up and put it in a drawer with all the other documentation from this whole situation. Work became the place where I could focus on something other than the relationship and recovery. I threw myself into projects, volunteering for extra shifts, learning new systems and procedures. Kevin noticed during a one-on-one meeting. He said he was glad I was engaged with my job, but gently suggested I make sure I wasn't using work to avoid processing feelings. I appreciated his concern, but I also genuinely enjoyed feeling competent and in control of something. At work, I knew the rules, I understood the systems, I could solve problems and help customers and see immediate results. It was simple and clear in a way my personal life wasn't. I told Kevin I was still going to therapy and the support group, that I wasn't avoiding anything, I just liked having something I was good at. He seemed satisfied with that answer and told me I was doing great at my job. He mentioned they'd be posting an assistant manager position soon, and the idea of a promotion felt like proof I was moving forward, instead of staying stuck in what happened with Ryan. Miriam invited me to her book club the following month. I almost said no because I hadn't read the book and didn't know anyone in the group. But Miriam insisted I'd like everyone and they wouldn't care if I hadn't read it. The book club met at someone's house with wine and snacks, and about 8 women sitting around talking. They did discuss the book for maybe 20 minutes, and then moved on to talking about their lives and jobs and families. Miriam introduced me to everyone and they welcomed me without making a big deal about it. One woman mentioned she worked at a law firm and another talked about her kids, and someone else complained about her landlord. It was normal, friendly conversation, and I realized how much I'd missed this. Ryan had slowly cut me off from social events, always having a reason why we should stay home, or why my friends were annoying, or why he needed me to skip plans. I didn't notice it happening because it was gradual, but sitting in this room full of women laughing and talking made me see how isolated I'd become. After book club ended, Miriam drove me home and asked if I had fun. I told her I did and thanked her for including me. She said her friend group was always looking for new people and I should come to their next event. The support group continued meeting every week and I kept going. Hearing from women who were years into their recovery gave me hope. One woman talked about being abuse-free for 5 years and recently getting engaged to someone who respected her boundaries. She said she never thought she'd trust anyone again, but therapy and time helped her heal enough to try. Listening to her describe her healthy relationship made me think maybe I wouldn't always be this damaged or scared. Another woman warned that some responses to trauma never fully disappear. You just learn to manage them better. She said she still flinched sometimes when her husband moved too quickly, even though he'd never hurt her. She explained it like having a smoke alarm that's too sensitive, going off even when there's no real fire. That made sense to me because I still had those phantom pinching sensations and the hypervigilance in parking lots. Maybe those things would fade more over time, or maybe they'd always be there in some form. Either way, hearing other women talk about their experiences made me feel less alone and less broken. I downloaded a dating app 6 months after leaving Ryan. I set up my profile with recent photos and a bio that was honest but not too heavy. I matched with a few guys and chatted with them before agreeing to meet one for coffee. His name was James and he worked in IT and seemed nice from his messages. We met at a busy coffee shop on a Saturday afternoon. James was friendly and asked about my job and hobbies. The conversation flowed easily and I started to relax. Then he reached across the table and touched my arm while making a point about something funny. It was a light, affectionate touch, the kind normal people do on dates. I flinched so hard I knocked over my water glass. Water spread across the table and I grabbed napkins trying to clean it up. James looked confused and concerned. He asked if I was okay and apologized for startling me. I had to decide right then whether to explain about Ryan or make up an excuse. I chose honesty and told him a simplified version. I said I'd gotten out of a bad relationship a few months ago and I was still jumpy sometimes. James said he understood and he was sorry that happened to me, but I could tell it made him uncomfortable. The rest of the date felt awkward, and when we left he said he'd text me, but I knew he wouldn't. Walking to my car, I felt discouraged, but also proud of myself for trying. I talked to Vivian the next week about dating again, and she asked how the coffee shop incident made me feel. I told her embarrassed and frustrated that I couldn't even handle a normal touch without freaking out. She said that reaction was completely normal given what I'd been through, and the guy's discomfort was his problem, not mine. We discussed when to tell new people about Ryan, and she said there wasn't one right answer. She explained that it's usually better to wait until some trust builds between you and the other person, and to watch how they react when you set boundaries about anything. She reminded me that someone who gets pushy or annoyed when you say no to small things will definitely not respect bigger boundaries about your history. She said healthy partners don't demand explanations before you're ready to share them, and they don't make you feel bad for having trauma responses. 6 months after leaving Ryan, I stopped at a coffee shop near the bank during my lunch break. I was waiting for my order when someone called my name, and I turned to see Keith standing behind me. He looked uncomfortable but walked over anyway, and said he'd been hoping to run into me. He apologized again for not realizing what Ryan was doing, and said he felt guilty for not speaking up sooner. I told him it wasn't his fault and asked how he was doing. Keith said he was good, but then added that Ryan had moved to another state for a job opportunity. He explained that Ryan wanted to get away from everything that happened here and start fresh somewhere new. I asked if Ryan ever acknowledged what he did, and Keith's face told me the answer before he spoke. He said Ryan still frames it as a relationship that didn't work out, not as abuse. Keith said Ryan talks about how we weren't compatible and how I overreacted to his affection. I wasn't surprised because abusers rarely accept responsibility, but hearing it confirmed still bothered me. Keith said he tried talking to Ryan about it, but Ryan shut down the conversation. I thanked Keith for telling me and said I was just glad Ryan was far away now. Keith nodded and said he hoped I was doing better, and I told him honestly that I was. I started noticing small changes in myself around that time. I laughed more easily at work when Miriam told jokes, and I didn't spend every moment scanning my surroundings for danger. One morning, I put on a short-sleeved shirt without thinking about it, and only realized later that I hadn't checked my arms for marks first. At the grocery store, a friend from high school hugged me, and I didn't tense up or pull away. These tiny things felt like huge victories. I told Vivian about them during our next session, and she smiled and said, "That's exactly how healing works." She explained that people expect dramatic breakthroughs where everything suddenly gets better, but real recovery happens in small steps. She said noticing I could wear short sleeves without anxiety was just as important as any big realization. She reminded me to celebrate these moments instead of waiting for some perfect healed state that might never come. Janet called me about 3 weeks before the 1-year anniversary of leaving Ryan. She said she wanted to throw me a party to celebrate, and I initially said no, because it felt weird to celebrate leaving an abusive relationship. Janet said it wasn't about celebrating the abuse, it was about celebrating my strength and freedom and the fact that I got out. She convinced me by saying all the people who helped me wanted to acknowledge the milestone together. The party was at Janet's apartment on a Saturday afternoon. When I arrived, there was a cake on the table that said 1 year stronger in blue frosting. Janet had bought gifts that were all about self-care and independence, things like a nice journal, bath products, and a gift card for a massage. Women from my support group came, along with Miriam and several other coworkers from the bank. Mike even stopped by for a little while. Everyone was laughing and talking, and it felt good to be surrounded by people who supported me through the worst time of my life. I looked around the room and felt grateful for every single person there. About an hour into the party, Janet asked if I wanted to say anything. I hadn't prepared a speech, but I stood up and tried to put my feelings into words. I thanked everyone for their help and said I couldn't have left Ryan without their intervention and support. I specifically mentioned Mike for recognizing the abuse and taking action when I couldn't see it myself. I thanked Janet for speaking up at her birthday party, even though Ryan made her feel bad about it. I thanked Kevin for offering workplace resources and never making me feel ashamed. I thanked Vivian for teaching me what healthy relationships actually look like, and for helping me understand I deserved better. My voice started shaking, and I saw several people wiping their eyes. I said I spent so long thinking love was supposed to hurt, and they all showed me it wasn't. By the time I finished talking, I was crying, and so were half the people in the room. Janet hugged me and whispered that she was proud of me. A few weeks after the party, I realized I wanted to help other people the way everyone helped me. I called Vivian and asked if the community center needed volunteers. She said they always needed people for the crisis hotline and asked if I'd be interested in training. I signed up for the next training session, which was 8 weeks of classes about recognizing abuse, safety planning, and how to talk to people in crisis. The training was hard because it brought up a lot of my own experiences, but it also felt purposeful. Learning the official terminology for what Ryan did helped me understand it wasn't unique to our relationship. It was a pattern that happened to lots of people. After finishing the training, I started staffing the hotline 1 evening a week. My first few calls were nerve-wracking, but the other volunteers helped me through them. 3 months into volunteering, I took a call from a young woman who sounded scared. She said her boyfriend had been play-fighting with her and it was leaving bruises. She kept calling it roughhousing and saying he didn't mean to hurt her, but I heard the same justifications I used to make about Ryan. I asked her some questions about how often it happened and whether she'd asked him to stop. She said she told him the bruises hurt, but he laughed and said she was being too sensitive. She said she was calling because her roommate saw the marks and got worried, but she wasn't sure if it counted as abuse since he claimed he was just playing. I told her carefully about my own experience with Ryan and how he called the pinching his love language. I explained that abusers often disguise violence as affection or play to make you question your own perception. She started crying and said she thought she was crazy for being scared of someone who said he loved her. I told her she wasn't crazy and her fear was valid. We talked for almost an hour about safety planning and resources in her area. She thanked me before hanging up and said talking to someone who understood made her feel less alone. That call stayed with me for days afterward. I kept thinking about how easily I could have stayed with Ryan if no one had intervened. I imagined the parallel universe where Mike didn't confront him at the gym, where Kevin didn't offer me resources at work, where Janet didn't speak up at her party. In that version of my life, I might still be getting pinched every day and telling myself it was love. Or maybe Ryan would have escalated to hitting me or worse. The thought made me feel sick, but also grateful. I realized how lucky I was that so many people recognized what was happening and refused to stay silent. Not everyone has that support system, and I knew from the hotline that lots of people stay in abusive relationships for years because no one helps them see it for what it is. Vivian told me during our next session that she thought I was ready to graduate from weekly therapy to monthly check-ins. She said I'd done the hard work of processing the trauma, understanding the patterns that led me to accept abuse, and building a life where I felt safe and supported. I felt proud hearing her say that, but also scared to have less structure. I told her it felt like training wheels coming off, and I wasn't sure I could balance on my own. Vivian smiled and said that's exactly why she was transitioning me to monthly, instead of ending therapy completely. She reminded me I could always come back to weekly sessions if I needed more support, and she'd still be available if something came up between our scheduled appointments. She said the goal wasn't to make me not need therapy anymore, it was to help me build enough skills and support that I didn't need it as intensely. Janet invited me to a dinner party at her friend's house about a month later. I almost said no because I still felt awkward at social events, but I forced myself to go. That's where I met Tom. He was friends with Janet's boyfriend and worked in software development. We ended up talking for most of the evening about normal things like our jobs and favorite restaurants. At the end of the night, he asked for my number and I gave it to him. We texted for a few weeks before he asked me to dinner. On our first date, he was patient and respectful, and asked permission before touching me even in small ways. When the check came, he reached toward my hand and then stopped and asked if it was okay to hold it. At first, his constant checking felt excessive, like he was making a bigger deal out of touch than necessary. But then I realized he was giving me control over my own body in every single interaction. After a few dates, I told him about Ryan in basic terms. Just that I'd gotten out of an abusive relationship about 8 months ago. Tom listened without interrupting, and then said he was glad I got out, and he'd never make me feel unsafe. He didn't ask for details or act like my trauma was too much to handle. He just accepted it as part of my history, and kept treating me with the same respect he had from the beginning. Tom never pushed me on anything. Our first few dates, he asked before holding my hand or putting his arm around me. When we kissed for the first time, he checked in afterward to make sure I was comfortable. At first I thought maybe he was just overly cautious or had read too many articles about consent, but over the next few months I realized he was just genuinely careful with me. He noticed when I tensed up or pulled away slightly, and he never made me feel bad about it. We'd be watching a movie on his couch and he'd reach toward me, then pause and ask if it was okay to put his arm around my shoulders. Sometimes I said yes, and sometimes I said I needed space, and either way he was fine with it. Around 3 months in, I had a nightmare about Ryan and woke up crying in Tom's bed. He woke up too and asked if I was okay, if I needed anything. I told him about the dream, about how Ryan used to pinch me awake sometimes just because he wanted my attention. Tom listened without interrupting or trying to fix it. He just sat there next to me in the dark and held my hand. He said he was glad I got away from Ryan, and he promised he'd never make me feel unsafe like that. The way he said it was so simple and honest. Not dramatic or performative. Just a fact. I started crying harder because I realized I actually believed him. With Ryan, I was always waiting for the next pinch, the next twist of skin, the next reminder that my body wasn't really mine. With Tom, I could relax completely. I could fall asleep next to him without worrying I'd wake up in pain. The protective order was set to expire exactly 1 year after the judge made it permanent. About a month before the expiration date, I got a notice in the mail asking if I wanted to renew it. I sat at my kitchen table looking at the form, trying to figure out what I wanted to do. Keith had told me a few months earlier that Ryan was dating someone new, a woman he met through work after he moved to the other state. Part of me worried about her, wondered if Ryan was pinching her too and calling it love. But Keith said Ryan seemed different, calmer, like maybe moving away and losing everything here had actually changed him. I didn't know if that was true or if Keith was just being optimistic. I called Vivian and asked her opinion about renewing the order. She said it was completely my choice, that there was no wrong answer. If I felt safer with it in place, I should renew it. If I felt like I didn't need it anymore, that was okay too. She reminded me that Ryan hadn't tried to contact me since moving away, hadn't violated the order after that first incident at my apartment building. I thought about it for a few more days and finally decided not to renew it. Partly because I genuinely didn't think I needed legal protection from Ryan anymore, but mostly because I wanted to prove to myself that I wasn't still living in fear of him. I wanted to show myself that he didn't have power over me anymore, that I could exist in the world without a court order between us. When the expiration date came and went, I felt lighter somehow, like I'd taken back another piece of my life. Kevin called me into his office about a week after the protective order expired. I got nervous for a second, that old fear that I was in trouble, but he was smiling when I walked in. He told me he was recommending me for a promotion to assistant manager, and the regional director had approved it. I just stared at him, not sure if I'd heard right. Kevin laughed and said I deserved it, that I'd shown incredible strength and resilience during a really difficult time, And that kind of character was exactly what they looked for in leadership. The promotion came with a significant raise, enough that I could finally afford to move out of my apartment, the one that still had memories of Ryan in every room. I thanked Kevin probably too many times and he waved it off, saying I'd earned this on my own merit. That afternoon, I started looking at apartments online, scrolling through listings and imagining living somewhere that Ryan had never been, somewhere without any history or bad memories attached to it. I found a place in a nicer neighborhood with good security, a building that had cameras in the parking lot and a locked entrance. The rent was higher than what I was paying, but with my new salary, I could manage it. I scheduled a viewing for that weekend and brought Janet with me for a second opinion. The apartment was perfect, bright and clean with big windows and a kitchen that actually had counter space. Janet said it was exactly what I needed, a fresh start in a place that was entirely mine. Moving day was exhausting but satisfying. Janet and Miriam both helped me pack and load everything into a rental truck. I didn't have that much stuff because Ryan had controlled most of our shared belongings, insisting his taste was better than mine. Now I got to choose everything myself, from the furniture to the wall color to where I hung pictures. The new building had an elevator which made moving easier, and my neighbors seemed friendly when they passed us in the hallway. I spent the first few days unpacking and arranging everything exactly how I wanted it. I put my couch against the wall where it got the best light. I hung curtains I actually liked instead of the dark heavy ones Ryan had insisted on. I bought plants for the windowsills and colorful throw pillows for the couch. Every choice was mine and mine alone. No one else's opinion to consider or accommodate. That first night in the new apartment, I made dinner in my kitchen and ate it on my couch and watched whatever show I wanted on TV. Then I went to bed in my bedroom that I'd painted a soft blue, and I slept straight through the night without any nightmares. No dreams about being pinched or trapped. No waking up in a panic checking for bruises. Just peaceful sleep in a space that was completely safe and completely mine. Janet came over the next weekend with painting supplies and a huge grin. She said we were painting the living room whether I was ready or not, and she'd already picked out the color. It was a bright, cheerful yellow that she knew Ryan would have hated, and that's exactly why she chose it. We spent the whole day painting, covering the boring beige walls with this sunny yellow that made the whole room feel happier. While we painted, Janet talked about how much I'd changed since leaving Ryan. She said when she first tried to talk to me about the bruises at her birthday party, I was so defensive and unwilling to hear anything negative about him. Now I was living on my own, setting boundaries, doing work I loved, dating someone who actually respected me. She said she was amazed by the transformation, that I went from someone who couldn't say no to someone who knew exactly what she wanted. I told her it wasn't really a transformation, more like remembering who I was before Ryan convinced me I was wrong about everything. She hugged me and got yellow paint on both our shirts, and we laughed about it. By evening, the living room was done and it looked incredible, bright and welcoming, and nothing like the dark, cramped space I'd shared with Ryan. Tom met my family for the first time at my cousin's birthday party, the same cousin who got married where Ryan had pinched me through the whole ceremony. I was nervous about bringing Tom around my relatives, worried they'd compare him to Ryan or ask awkward questions. But Tom was relaxed and friendly with everyone, talking to my uncle about sports and helping my aunt carry food to the tables. My aunt pulled me aside while Tom was getting us drinks and said she needed to tell me something. She said she was so relieved to see me with someone like Tom, someone who clearly respected me and treated me well. She admitted she'd been worried about me during my relationship with Ryan, the way he grabbed my arm in public and how I always seemed tense around him. She said she didn't know how to help at the time, didn't want to overstep or make things worse. I told her that speaking up is always worth it even if the person isn't ready to hear it, because it plants seeds that might grow later. I said Janet's words at her birthday party stuck with me even though I defended Ryan at the time, and those seeds eventually helped me realize I needed to leave. My aunt hugged me and said she was proud of how far I'd come and she really liked Tom. I watched Tom across the yard laughing at something my cousin said, and I felt grateful that my family got to see me happy with someone who was actually good for me. The crisis hotline training program took several months to complete. I had to learn de-escalation techniques, how to assess suicide risk, how to connect people with local resources. Vivian supervised my practice calls and gave me feedback on my approach. She said I had a natural ability to meet people where they were emotionally, to listen without judgment and help them see their situations more clearly. After I finished training, I started taking more complex calls on my regular volunteer shifts. One night I talked to a man whose wife had just left him and he was having thoughts of hurting himself. I stayed on the line with him for over an hour, helping him make a safety plan and connecting him with a counselor in his area. Another night I talked to a teenager whose parents were fighting constantly, and she didn't know how to cope. I shared some of what I'd learned in therapy about managing anxiety and finding support. The work was emotionally heavy, and sometimes I'd go home after a shift feeling drained, but it was also deeply satisfying. Every call where I helped someone feel less alone or see a way forward felt like I was turning my worst experience into something meaningful. Vivian told me during one of our monthly check-ins that she thought I'd found my calling, that helping others was clearly important to me. I hadn't thought about it that way, but she was right. This work made me feel purposeful in a way nothing else did. 2 years after I left Ryan, I barely thought about him anymore. Occasionally something would trigger a memory, like seeing someone get grabbed roughly in public, or hearing about abuse on the news. And sometimes when I was on the hotline talking to someone in a similar situation, I'd remember specific moments from my relationship with Ryan, but mostly he just wasn't part of my daily thoughts anymore. The constant hypervigilance had faded. I didn't check over my shoulder in parking lots or scan every room for exits. I could be touched without flinching. I could relax in public spaces without that background anxiety. I still had some trust issues that probably weren't going away completely. I was cautious about new people, and I paid close attention to how men treated women around them. But these weren't controlling my life anymore. They were just part of how I moved through the world now. Tom understood, and never made me feel broken or damaged for having boundaries. When I told him about a nightmare I'd had, or a moment when something reminded me of Ryan, he listened and validated my feelings without trying to fix me. I appreciated that he saw my trauma as part of my history, but not the defining feature of who I was. Tom and I moved in together after dating for about 14 months. I was nervous about sharing space with someone again, worried I'd fall back into old patterns of accommodating someone else's preferences over my own. But living with Tom was surprisingly easy. We talked about how to split chores and bills, we compromised on decorating choices, we gave each other space when we needed it. When we had disagreements, he never raised his voice or used his physical presence to intimidate me. We'd talk through whatever the issue was and find a solution that worked for both of us. One night I was washing dishes, and he came up behind me to hug me, and I tensed up automatically. He stepped back immediately and asked if I was okay. I told him I was fine, just that being grabbed from behind still made me nervous sometimes. He apologized and said he'd be more careful about approaching me when I couldn't see him coming. The fact that he adjusted his behavior without making me feel bad about my reaction meant everything. A few weeks later, I told him how different this felt from living with Ryan, how I could actually relax in my own home instead of constantly bracing for pain. Tom said this was just what normal, healthy relationships looked like, that respecting each other's boundaries and communicating openly should be the baseline, not something special. I ran into Mike at the grocery store on a random Tuesday afternoon. I was in the produce section looking at apples when I heard someone say my name. I turned around and there was Mike, looking exactly the same except he'd grown a beard. We hugged and spent a few minutes catching up right there between the fruit and the vegetables. He told me he'd finished his doctorate and was working as a physical therapist now, helping people recover from injuries and surgeries. He still trained people at the gym a few evenings a week because he enjoyed it. I told him I was doing great, that I was living with my boyfriend Tom, and working as an assistant manager at the bank, and volunteering on a crisis hotline. Mike smiled and said he was really glad his intervention had helped, that he'd always wondered if he did the right thing by confronting Ryan so aggressively. I assured him he absolutely did the right thing, that his willingness to get involved probably saved me from worse abuse down the line. He said the whole experience taught him a lot about boundaries and consent, about how to use his authority and physical presence responsibly. We exchanged numbers and promised to stay in touch, then went our separate ways through the store. Walking to my car afterward, I felt grateful for all the people who'd stepped in to help me when I couldn't help myself. A few months later, Vivian called me with a request. The community center was planning their annual fundraiser, and they wanted me to speak about my experience as both a survivor and a volunteer. My stomach dropped when she asked. Speaking to small groups on the crisis hotline was one thing, but standing on a stage telling my story to a room full of strangers felt completely different. I told Vivian I needed to think about it. She said to take my time, but reminded me that public stories help other people recognize abuse and seek help. That night, I talked to Tom about it. He listened while I explained my nervousness about being so public with something so personal. He asked what I was most afraid of, and I realized I was scared people would judge me for staying with Ryan as long as I did, or think I was weak for not leaving sooner. Tom said anyone who judged me for that didn't understand abuse, and their opinion shouldn't matter more than the people I could help by speaking up. I called Vivian the next day and agreed to do it. She helped me prepare by having me practice telling my story in shorter chunks, focusing on the facts without getting lost in emotions. The night of the fundraiser arrived faster than I wanted. I stood backstage at the community center watching other speakers talk about the organization's impact. My hands were shaking, and I kept running through what I planned to say. When they called my name, I walked onto the stage and looked out at about 200 people. I started by explaining how the pinching began as something small and escalated into systematic abuse. I talked about the bruises and how Ryan called them love marks. I described Janet confronting him at her party, Kevin offering workplace resources, and Mike recognizing the abuse pattern and taking action. I explained how hard it was to accept that what I experienced was abuse because Ryan had convinced me it was just his way of loving me. I talked about the protective order and the support group and learning what healthy relationships actually look like. I ended by saying that asking for help was the bravest thing I ever did, and getting out was possible even when it felt impossible. The applause was loud and sustained. Afterward, at least a dozen people approached me. Some thanked me for speaking up. Others shared their own stories quietly, saying they recognized themselves in my experience. One woman told me she'd been making excuses for her boyfriend's behavior, but hearing my story made her realize she needed to get out. Another person asked for information about the crisis hotline because their sister was in a similar situation. Walking to my car that night, I felt exhausted but good about speaking publicly. Tom was waiting up when I got home and asked how it went. I told him it was scary but worthwhile, that several people said my story helped them see their own situations more clearly. Janet called me on a Tuesday afternoon about 6 months later, her voice high with excitement. She said she had news and could she come over right away. 20 minutes later, she was sitting on my couch showing me her engagement ring. Her boyfriend had proposed over the weekend during a hike they'd been planning for months. I hugged her and we spent an hour looking at the ring and talking about how he'd set up the proposal. Then she asked if I would be her maid of honor. I said yes immediately, and we started talking about wedding plans right there. Over the next several months, I helped Janet with everything from choosing her dress to tasting cakes to addressing invitations. Being part of her wedding planning felt completely different from attending my cousin's wedding with Ryan. At my cousin's ceremony, Ryan had pinched me constantly, and I'd spent the whole event tense and hurting. Now I was genuinely happy for Janet, excited about the romance and the celebration, not triggered by watching her and her fiancé be affectionate with each other. When they kissed or held hands, I felt happy for them instead of reminded of my own pain. That felt like real proof of how far I'd come in my healing. Janet and I were addressing invitations one afternoon when she asked if I was doing okay with all the wedding stuff, if it brought up bad memories. I told her honestly that I was fine, that her wedding felt joyful in a way my cousin's wedding couldn't, because I wasn't being hurt through the whole thing. She squeezed my hand and said she was glad I was in a better place now. The wedding day arrived warm and sunny. I stood with the other bridesmaids getting ready, helping Janet with her dress and makeup. She looked beautiful and calm, not nervous at all. The ceremony was outdoors in a garden, and Janet walked down the aisle beaming. During the reception, I gave my maid of honor toast. I talked about friendship and support and how the people who love you will always show up when you need them most. I said Janet had been there for me during one of the hardest times in my life, that she'd spoken up when she saw something wrong even though it was uncomfortable. I didn't mention Ryan by name, but Janet knew I was partly talking about how she'd confronted him at her birthday party, how that had been the first crack in the wall of denial I'd built around his abuse. I said true friends tell you the truth even when it's hard to hear, and Janet had done that for me. By the end of the toast, several guests were crying, including Janet. People came up to me afterward saying the toast was beautiful and meaningful. One of Janet's aunts told me it was the most honest maid of honor speech she'd ever heard. 3 years after leaving Ryan, I sat at my desk at the bank reviewing loan applications. I'd been promoted to assistant manager a year ago, and Kevin had told me last week that he was recommending me for the branch manager position at a new location opening across town. Tom and I had been living together for over a year, and we'd started talking seriously about getting engaged. He'd even asked subtle questions about what kind of ring I liked. I was still volunteering at the crisis hotline every week, taking calls from people trying to figure out if their relationships were healthy or abusive. My arms were bare in my short sleeve shirt, no bruises anywhere, just normal skin. The fear that used to follow me everywhere had faded into something manageable. I still paid attention to how people treated each other, and I still had boundaries that Tom respected completely, but I wasn't constantly afraid anymore. I'd learned that love should never hurt, that asking for help wasn't weakness but strength, and that healing was possible even when the damage felt permanent. My story hadn't ended when I left Ryan. That was just the beginning of a better chapter, one where I got to decide what love looked like and who deserved access to my life.